a bargaining chip that was used to broker some of these other deals for post-war Nazi survival and collusion with elements of the American military-industrial complex. That's precisely what I'm getting at here. But, again, putting it into the context of what I'm arguing in the books, the technology and the physics represented by the bell, in my opinion, and again, I lay out the argument in much more detail in the Nazi International, but in my opinion, that technology they kept to themselves. In other words, they kept the really cool stuff to themselves.
The war decisive
and were
stuff.
giving us and the Soviets basically a roughly equal division of the spoils to kind of set up the long-term circumstances for the Cold War. So, they planned this post-war strategic evacuation with a great deal of finesse.
Yes, and also, I believe, with a sizable war chest to work from.
Oh, yes, absolutely. A former associate of the CBS journalist Ed Murrow, who was, of course, the Walter Cronkite before Walter Cronkite, an associate of his by the name of Paul Manning wrote a book that, when I read this, it floored me, because the book was called Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile. And he reports that and the reason he wrote his book was basically because, as a journalist, he was incensed at the way that journalists had treated his associate, Ladislas Farrell, who, of course, wrote Martin Bormann, The Fourth Reich. All right? And Farrago reproduced all sorts of documents from the Argentinian Central de Inteligencia, their Central Intelligence, that basically maintained that Bormann was alive, well, and under sort of the protective surveillance of the Argentine government. Well, Paul Manning dug a little further into the story and published his book, Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile, and he came to the stunning conclusion that Bormann and Peron controlled approximately $800 million.
Oh, my.
That's $1945, folks.
Oh, my.
Just in Argentina alone.
Oh, my goodness.
And the real shocker, and this is kind of where I pick up with my scenario of post-war collusion between this Nazi International and the Anglo-American corporate banking elite. All right? Think Bilderbergers here.
Okay.
Because Martin Bormann, according to Manning's research, actually sometime in the early 1960s cashed a check for, I think, something like $2 million, something like that. Cashed a check over his own signature, drawn from Chase Manhattan and manufacturers Hanover Banks.
Oh, my.
And it was cleared through Deutsche Bank in Buenos Aires. Ha 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 ha. Ha 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 ha.
Oh, my.
Yeah. So, I write in a book of mine called Babylon's Banksters, if you look at the real founding intention and purposes for the Bilderbergers, I think the hidden intention, since you have Prince Bernhard, a former SS officer, who therefore would be in the chain of command of any post-war Nazi organization.
Oh, yes.
And a good friend of theirs by the name of Dr. Hermann Josef Abs, who turns out to have been the CEO of Deutsche Bank during this period. During the war, he was working for a small handling bank in Berlin, but this small handling bank in Berlin was actually the bank that handled the payment of salaries to government officials. In other words, this Dr. Hermann Josef Abs was the guy that was paying Adolf Hitler his salary as Reichschancellor. So I think with the Bilderbergers, what you have as a secret purpose is meetings to coordinate this vast movement of Nazi loot into Western banks, and then to launder it back into Europe as the means for the post-war reconstruction of Europe. So in other words, you have even in the European Union, you have a very long-term, very hidden, very deeply buried Nazi influence in the creation of this post-war circumstance and geopolitical arrangement.
Yes. And I'm thinking that as we near our next break here, perhaps to set the stage for the conversation to follow, and just in case some of our listening audience is still experiencing a bit of that cognitive dissonance.
Cosmic dissonance, yeah.
I think that a way of helping to understand some of the possible scope and magnitude of the presence that was established largely through creation of corporations within a range of different types of industries. But Martin Borman was quite a Donald Trump of his day. He had a mind, it seems, for making money and expanding their grasp. And just before we finish here up before this next break, it's my belief that Alan Dulles and I think our Justice Department, our system went into work following the war to try to close down, to shut down as many of those corporations that had been founded by Martin Borman, during and prior. And yet, of course, the extent of our reach could not make it into different parts of the world. Nothing we couldn't touch in Russia or China or different parts of the globe as well. But, Dr. Farrell, do you have a sense of that scope, of just how many corporations we did shut down or learn of and close?
The actual U.S. Treasury reports say that there were approximately 750 corporate fronts that were found and discovered largely by American Treasury investigators after the war, and that were shut down. All right. This, in my opinion, if you read the Nazi International, this, in my opinion, was the tip of the iceberg. The reason why is that Borman himself had not only his own considerable financial genius, but again, he was closely connected with Dr. Hermann Josef Ops and another very prominent figure in Nazi finance, and that's Dr. Hjalmar Schacht. All right. These men, I think, were very successful in creating a kind of a smokescreen operation as well for the Allies to follow. In other words, I think this is more or less what the Allies found was what they wanted to be found.
I see.
And, the proof of the pudding here is the fact that they were not able to get their hands on nearly $1 billion in the hands of Juan Peron. That was in Argentina. And again, that's just one country in Latin America. You have several others. Now, I think, in all likelihood, what really happened, the other alternative explanation for this story is that, this was a cover story, that, these funds were confiscated, but I think really that was kind of a cover story to move this money into those Western banks, in short, to launder it. And the reason I say that is if you're dealing with a post-war Nazi organization with basically German military intelligence left intact after the war under the same Nazi general commanding it, and that organization is in turn plugged into the other little Nazi cells all over Europe and South America and so on. If you're dealing with an organization like that, then they do have a bargaining chip to sit down at a table behind closed doors with those Western bankers and say, okay, now look, Mr. Rockefeller, we're giving you all this money you can put on your books, or rather, you can keep off of your books, expand your ledger credit entry-making ability, and give you quite a reserve here. But know this, that if you don't keep your end of the bargain, we can find you.
Oh, my.
In other words, when you're dealing with Martin Borman, you're dealing with Dick Cheney without the warmth and charm.
Now, that's truly chilling to contemplate.
Yeah, that's truly chilling to contemplate. In other words, you are quite literally entering into an agreement not only with a kind of mafia godfather figure, you're dealing with a real organization with long reach.
Oh boy!
And you'd better be keeping all the I's and T's dotted and crossed just so, because if any party to that agreement breaks it, rest assured there will be consequences.
Oh my! And it certainly sounds like they had the toys by way of their research programs to
Bingo.
to make good on those
Bingo.
sorts of threats.
Bingo.
Yeah.
This
Dr.
Antonin,
Farrell?
I think, is one of the hidden covert things that's happening in the world right now.
Oh yes. Dr. Farrell, I do apologize, but we do need to take another short break here in the show. And what a fascinating and interesting stage I think that we've set for where we'll turn our conversation to next. Ladies and gentlemen, you're listening to the Crimson Pill radio program with your host Antonin Fiore and our distinguished guest today, Dr. Joseph Farrell, and his body of work. Join us in just a few moments, and we'll continue our conversation. And welcome back to the Crimson Pill, ladies and gentlemen. I'm your host, Antonin Fiore. We're joined today, our featured guest is Dr. Joseph Farrell, an academic, a researcher, a lecturer, and an author whose range of work is breathtaking, quite frankly. And in today's conversation, we've been focused on the body of his work that pertains to the Nazi International, some of the research, as well as some of the ideology, really, behind the Nazi Party, its effect, of course, in obvious ways on world history. Dr. Farrell, before we continue this last thread of our conversation, one thing that I'd like to make sure that we have a chance to talk a bit about is what's the best way for folks to make their way to your body of work. Myself, I think I have a copy of all but your most recent book, and I surely encourage our listening audience to start building their library as well. It's just every page is loaded with well-researched and carefully considered information. What's the best way for folks to find out more about your current work and what you have available?
Well, actually, they can go to my website. It's www.Giza Death Star. That's Giza, and then the words DeathStar.com. That's all lowercase, all one word, no space or anything. And I do have a web store on the website, so they can get all my books there. But that would be the easiest way. If they don't like doing that online, then Barnes and Noble or Borders or any of those stores usually carry my books. If they don't, they're perfectly willing to special order them. But they can get them off my website.
Certainly. Fantastic. And I think I would add another kind of layer to that as well. Dr. Farrell's website is, in my feeling, very wonderfully done in that you can access a range of topics that Dr. Farrell has commented on, some almost white paper type level, as well as more in-depth information about any of the books, about the threads of his research. And Dr. Farrell, I'm really impressed by the quality of the interaction that some of the other folks who follow your work. I'm on one of the email mailing lists where you're just kind of continually giving the world a heads up about some essential topics that are happening all around us, and having done so quite well, again, from your style, which is, I think, such a reasoned voice in a field of sometimes eccentricity. Any other thoughts about your website, maybe some new feature or anything that I have neglected to mention here?
No, there, like you say, there's I have white papers on there. I have a members-only area which is accessed by subscription, and I do video chats with people on that are members of the website, and basically those are kind of freewheeling affairs where people just ask me questions and I respond. It's kind of more of an interactive thing than your typical interview or things like that. And like you say, I post white papers there on various subjects. I'm working on a couple right now that I had planned to get done earlier this week, but this sort of business, the plans oftentimes get left by the wayside. But I am working on a couple more white papers where I go a little bit more in depth and technical detail than I do in my blogging or in my books.